You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
LifeLock, how can I help?
The IRS said I filed my return,
but I haven't.
1 in 4 tax-paying Americans has paid the price of identity fraud.
What do I do?
My refund, though.
I'm freaking out.
Don't worry, I can fix this.
LifeLock fixes identity theft guaranteed and gets your money back with up to $3 million in coverage.
I'm so relieved.
No problem. I'll be with you every step of the way.
1 in 4 was a fraud-paying American. Not anymore. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
The latest front of the Trump regime's mass deportation campaign, Operation Metro Surge in the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities area, has proven a lot of things about those currently in power. It shows Trump is willing to go as far as imaginable to appeal to his core constituents' nativism and racism and distract them from the harmful press of the Epstein files. It shows how much he favors political theater and spectacle, and it demonstrates that political retribution stands behind much of what he does. Revenge against blue states and specific figures who have opposed him, like Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, as he actually posted on social media directly after the murder of Renee Good by federal agents, warning of further, quote, reckoning and retribution, end quote. It shows how far he's willing to foster the us versus them narrative, so characteristic of fascist regimes, and take the dehumanization of those who oppose him to its greatest heights, from declaring even legal immigrants, quote, alien enemies, end quote, to now calling artists and mothers and nurses and veterans advocates like Renee Good and Alex Preddy, quote, domestic terrorists, end quote. It clearly reveals how unimportant truth is to the regime and how insistently they will gaslight the country, lying to the public in the face of undeniable video evidence that disproves what they're claiming. It proves their efforts to consolidate a top-down power structure have worked. With the judicial system strained by too many thousands of habeas corpus petitions to act as a sufficient bulwark against their authoritarian actions, Congress continuing to prove itself toothless, and the packed Supreme Court actually giving ICE carte blanche to detain individuals based solely on the color of their skin. In fact, many suspect that the operation has always been intended as a means of testing how far they can push their violation of constitutional rights. They've defied more court orders in a month, according to one district judge's opinion, than other federal agencies have done in their entire existence. They've stormed private homes without judicial warrant and then ignored inquiries from the press about why. They've arrested journalists simply for covering protests. They've arrested and brutalized protesters simply for exercising their constitutional right to observe and film them. They've even shot and killed protesters and made summary declarations as to the innocence of the federal agents who killed them without so much as an investigation. These actions violate the First Amendment rights of protesters and also the freedom of the press. Their racial profiling, illegal stops, deceptive ruses, impersonation of other agencies, warrantless raids, detentions without cause, and use of excessive force all violate Fourth Amendment rights. They've even violated the 10th Amendment by usurping local authority and infringing on state sovereignty, stressing the very relationship between states and the federal government in such a way as to assume the unchecked, autonomous, centralized power that all dictators claim for themselves. And recently, despite the rapidity with which Trump supporters and conservatives generally promote the notion of an individual right to lawfully keep and bear arms being protected by the Second Amendment, when Border Patrol officers shot 37-year-old nurse Alex Preddy for carrying a firearm that he was licensed to carry, a firearm that video evidence reveals was never brandished and remained holstered until the federal agents who killed him removed it from his waist. The administration's disregard of even those constitutional rights lauded by their constituents became clear, as did their hypocrisy, as in 2020, Kyle Rittenhouse was hailed as a hero by the Trump administration and its MAGA supporters for not just carrying a firearm, but as a minor, carrying it illegally and using it to kill unarmed protesters in the street. And last year, Trump pardoned some 1,500 January 6 rioters, many of whom, despite popular claims, were charged with carrying and possessing firearms and entering a restricted area with them. After Trump remarked in the wake of Preddy's death, quote, "You can't have guns, you can't walk in with guns," end quote, and First Assistant U.S. Attorney Bill Asaley wrote that, quote, "If you approach law enforcement with a gun, there is a high likelihood they will be legally justified in shooting you," end quote. Even the National Rifle Association had to recognize the hypocrisy, stating that the views taken by the administration were, quote, "dangerous and wrong," end quote, suggesting they were, quote, "demonizing law-abiding citizens," end quote, and called for an investigation. But this further revealed the hypocrisy of the NRA and of American freedoms in general. Because 10 years ago, when Philando Castile, a black man, was murdered by police in the Twin Cities area for legally carrying a firearm, the NRA failed to offer any such vigorous defense of the Second Amendment. And the history of gun law in America reveals that this perceived individual right to bear arms was never equally extended to African Americans. This is historical blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and to understand this inequality requires us to adopt a critical race theory approach to the history of constitutional freedoms and gun control laws in the U.S. That's right, it's the CRT boogeyman, but used here in the legitimate sense of an academic lens through which to view legal systems and public policy in order to better understand how racial inequality is perpetuated by these structures. Not in the culture war sense, which claims CRT is just any general topic in which the subject of race and injustice might arise. Thank you for joining me for The Gun Controllers: Freedom, Firearms, and Fear of Black Power. Before we begin, it's time to thank the newest patrons of the podcast. Thanks, Angela Kennedy and Susan. Thank you to all of my patrons. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode about the failed predictions of American millennialism, I released one on the long history of evangelicals accusing world figures of being the Antichrist, questioning the reluctance of many to recognize that Trump fits the bill better than any previous candidate. And after my episode on Crispus Attucks, I released a minisode examining the comparison of Trump's ICE with slave catchers. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. As I've spoken about before in my episode on gun violence in America back in 2022, and more recently in my episode Standing Army, Sitting President, there's a multiplicity of views regarding the reasoning and intent behind the Second Amendment. What we typically hear from gun rights activists is the individual right theory, the notion that the Second Amendment grants all private citizens the right to keep and bear arms. despite the text's emphasis on a well-regulated militia. The idea behind this is that militias being composed of private citizens, all individuals who in practice make up the rank and file of said militias, must be granted the right to bear arms, a sort of universal militia in which all able-bodied people might be called upon to take up their arms in defense of their nation. This is the view typically championed by the NRA, and there are real problems with it, not the least being the term, quote, well-regulated, end quote, which explicitly indicates that the Second Amendment refers to a militia that is not some universal concept or some self-appointed mob, but rather a lawfully appointed group. This is how the term militia is defined in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which grants Congress the power to organize the militia. A further conception of the Second Amendment that the NRA likes to resort to is the insurrectionist theory, the idea that the right to bear arms was written into the Constitution as a bulwark against authoritarian government, so that everyday citizens can defend themselves and overthrow a corrupt and tyrannical government. It's ironic now that the gun rights crowd is largely urging compliance in the face of the most egregious government overreach and militarized violence against citizenry since maybe the 19th century. Cries of "don't tread on me" have been transformed into the "yield man" refrain of Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. Of course, the more convincing view of the Second Amendment, in my view, as I've argued before, is that it was intended to establish decentralized military forces under the control of individual states rather than the federal government. Because early rebellions like the Whiskey Rebellion had proven the continued need for such forces, but the founders remained skeptical and wary of the threat of standing armies. By this reasoning, it must be recognized that the Second Amendment is now obsolete and invalid because we do have a standing army, the most powerful in the world, in fact, due to unmatched defense spending. Therefore, if we want the Second Amendment right to maintain a well-regulated militia, however you define that, then there should be no U.S. armed forces. You can't have it both ways. But there is yet another view of the Second Amendment, first expressed by Professor Carl Bogus in his UC Davis Law Review article, The Hidden History of the Second Amendment, and thereafter developed by other scholars, that really the Second Amendment was a bribe paid to the South to assure them that they would continue to be able to keep their own armed forces in order to put down slave rebellions. Therefore, it was never meant as a universal individual right to bear arms. It was granted as a right for slaveholding states to maintain the institution of slavery. It must be remembered that anti-federalists fought the ratification of the Constitution tooth and nail, typically by fear-mongering about such a government's potential abuses of power. Southern states specifically charged that the federal government could eventually abolish slavery and take their slaves away from them, which of course did eventually happen. The writing had been on the wall ever since Massachusetts abolished slavery in 1783, with wording quite similar to that of the Declaration of Independence, about all men being, quote, born free and equal, end quote, and, quote, entitled to liberty, end quote. And the South's protests over the potential uses to which such a government might put its power also took the form of cries for liberty. The irony was not lost on many. Influential English essayist Dr. Samuel Johnson remarked, quote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of slaves?" End quote. These southern states therefore refused to sign on to any union of states unless the Constitution protected slavery. Such protections were indeed written into the Constitution in the 3/5 Clause, the Slave Trade Clause, and the Fugitive Slave Clause. Additionally, Article 1, Section 8, empowering Congress to call forth the militia to suppress insurrections, can be viewed as a protection of slavery, as the principal worries of the South at the time were over slave rebellions. And indeed, all militias of the era have been characterized as glorified slave patrols. This was certainly true in the South, as slave catchers were engaged from among the ranks of the militias there. And in many cases, slave patrols were conducted as special militia assignments, such that slave patrollers were formally exempted from regular duty so they could catch and return escaped slaves or put down slave insurrections. Indeed, at the time, along with the fear of abolition, the fear of an insurrection drove much of Southern political policy. The 1739 Stono Rebellion remained fresh in their memory. A group of Central African enslaved men, some of them former soldiers in their homeland, broke into a firearms store, killed the proprietors, armed themselves, and began a march south, bound for Spanish-controlled Florida. Their forces grew along the way as other enslaved people threw off their bonds and joined them. They were only put down because a militia force was nearby. The militiamen decapitated the rebels and displayed their heads at every milepost along the road. A well-armed militia, quote, being necessary to the security of a free state, end quote, takes on a different meaning then with this context. The freedom certainly did not extend to those who were enslaved, and the security it referred to, at least in the South, was the security of the institution of slavery. It is thus a very convincing argument to assert that, like the other concessions made to Southern states who were so concerned about maintaining their institution of chattel slavery, the Second Amendment, too, was just a further protection of slavery, like the others, meant to ensure that Southerners would always be able to arm and organize their slave patrols. And it was offered by James Madison to mollify slaveholder Patrick Henry, he of the famous and, in this context, hypocritical "give me liberty or give me death" speech, who was very concerned over the threat of slave rebellion in Virginia. As another scholar put it, quote, "The Second Amendment was thus not some hallowed ground, but rather a bribe, paid again with black bodies," end quote. Before the enshrining in the Constitution of the right of white men to bear arms against black people, there had existed numerous laws explicitly prohibiting black gun possession. In Louisiana, for example, in 1724, they had instituted their own version of the existing French Code Noir that had been in effect throughout the Caribbean since 1685, and in it was included a decree stating, quote, "We forbid slaves to carry offensive weapons or heavy sticks under the penalty of being whipped and of having said weapons confiscated," end quote. Thus, enslaved persons were not allowed to carry any item with which they might defend themselves, let alone a firearm. The code granted only an exception for, quote, "those slaves who are sent a hunting or a shooting by their masters, and who carry with them a written permission to that effect," end quote. Essentially an early form of gun licensing. And after the terror inspired by the Stono Rebellion, the Negro Act of 1740, which legislated the explicit exclusion of all enslaved people from enjoying any civil rights, likewise made very clear that in addition to being forbidden from moving freely, assembling in groups, growing their own food, and learning to read and write, no enslaved person was allowed to keep or use, quote, "mischievous or dangerous weapons," end quote. So we see the history of gun control has from the beginning been a history of black disarmament to ensure white supremacy. And these laws became the template for other slave codes throughout the remainder of the 18th century, ensuring their authority to police their slave labor. And after the ratification of the Bill of Rights, these legal restrictions and their enforcement were only tightened because that same year, the existential dread of every slaveholder was made reality with the Haitian Revolution. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint Domingue, having suffered some of the worst tortures imaginable at the hands of their enslavers, rose up against French colonial rule, setting off a decade-long violent revolution for true liberty, not just liberty for some. In the nearby U.S., slaveholders and white people generally were terrified by stories and images of black rebels burning plantations and lynching their white overlords. In reality, the violence was reciprocal and very much asymmetrical. While it is true that at the conclusion of the war, Haitian revolutionaries massacred the remaining French colonists on the island, this came at the conclusion of a brutal 13 years of war during which Napoleon Bonaparte had conducted massacre after massacre, attempting genocide. In the end, 75,000 white French people had been killed, compared to 350,000 black people. But the story spread overseas was one of black bloodthirst and innocent white victimhood. It would drive white American Southerners to further entrench their racial supremacist power structures over the next 60 years, and even after the conclusion of the Civil War. Now for a brief intermission.
In January of 1915, Ernest Shackleton's ship, Endurance, became encased in the ice in the Weddell Sea. Through determination, grit, and savvy, Shackleton would lead his men through a brutal winter, then over hundreds of miles of Antarctic ice, followed by 800 miles across some of the roughest waters in the world. It is one of the most extraordinary and inspirational journeys in the history of exploration. Find this story and many others at the Explorers Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts or at explorerspodcast.com.
Yeah, Film Vault.
We are one of the original film podcasts.
That can't be true.
There was like 2 other film podcasts when we began, Brian.
How long have we been doing this show?
You and I first sat down and did a version of the show over 20 years ago.
My God.
There is shtick, but it's very little shtick.
We finish each other's
sandwiches?
Close enough.
Was that a joke on a movie?
Yeah, that's from Frozen.
Oh, it is.
Pretty bad.
Ugh.
Oh, look at you.
I don't want to be like quoting Frozen on this promo.
Okay, peek behind the curtain. Anderson's like the Frozen guy. Like, he'll constantly reference animated films, family films, and I'm more the edgy indie guy.
We do have the tropey thing going on where Brian does like the big Hollywood sexy summer movies. I'm always looking for like the hidden gems. 2 episodes each week. One,
we review movies, and the first episode, and the second one, top 5 time. Different top 5 every week. Movies that made you cry. Worst movie accents. Most disturbing movies. All right, the Film Vault, check it out.
Wherever you find podcasts.
That's right, the Film Vault, going on 20 plus years.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, back to the show. As the good fight for the abolition of slavery was underway, the idea that carrying a firearm was greatly important to black freedom became prominent. As the controversial 1850 fugitive slave law was enforced, whether an escaped slave or a freedman was able to resist kidnapping by slave catchers often depended on whether they were armed and could thus defend themselves. In 1854, Frederick Douglass declared that their security required, quote, a good revolver, a steady hand, and a determination to shoot down any man attempting to kidnap, end quote, and further stated that, quote, every slave hunter who meets a bloody death in his infernal business is an argument in favor of the manhood of our race, end quote. But the notorious 1856 Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court determined that black Americans could not be considered citizens, even if they were free, specifically because, among other reasons, it would grant them a right to keep and carry arms wherever they went, end quote, which the court found unacceptable. despite the conclusion of the Civil War a decade later, which saw the emancipation of all enslaved persons and the abolition of slavery in the 13th Amendment. The South remained both frightened of black reprisals and unrepentantly resolved to maintain white supremacy. Very quickly, new laws were passed, the Black Codes, which continued to enshrine many of the same laws as the slave codes. Free men were forced to indenture themselves as laborers, and the old laws against free movement and gathering became new laws against vagrancy. New were the laws against voting, but old were their laws forbidding black people from possessing firearms and other weapons, like Bowie knives. These laws essentially criminalized being black, and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery included a notorious exception that criminals could be used as slaves. Thus, any newly freed black person who refused to re-enter forced servitude through a labor contract, who armed themselves in self-defense, or who was even caught walking about and talking to others, could be legally enslaved again by being convicted of violating black codes and thereafter having their labor as a prisoner sold. It was slavery all over again, and Congress responded with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th Amendment, and the Freedmen Bureau Acts, which taken together overturned the Dred Scott decision, affirmed black citizenship, and guaranteed them all the rights of white people, including the right to possess firearms. After the Reconstruction Acts established military rule over the South to ensure that they would stop flouting the law of the land, the Black Codes came to be enforced in the late 1860s by the Ku Klux Klan. This group of masked domestic terrorists took it upon themselves to enforce the Black Codes when it became illegal to do so, enforcing social control through violence and psychological terror by targeting, intimidating, and lynching African Americans who were literate, owned property, spoke to white women, and refused to defer to white men, or tried to exercise their right to vote. They dressed in white robes to strike fear into their victims, pretending to be the ghosts of fallen Confederate soldiers. And among their chief purpose during their quote-unquote night rides was the disarmament of black citizens. The KKK was, in effect, one of the first gun control organizations. The bearing of arms would continue to have a prominent place in the fight for equality in the United States. Although the KKK would decline after the federal campaign to stamp them out in the 1870s, their mission had been accomplished with the institutionalization of Jim Crow segregation, and white supremacist violence and intimidation continued unabated. Pioneering journalist and anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells wrote toward the end of the 19th century, quote, "A Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give," end quote. The KKK would see a resurgence after its favorable portrayal in the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, but would decline again by the 20s due to the public awareness efforts of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. However, as the peaceful efforts of the Youth-Led Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, began to make real headway in the struggle for civil rights in the 50s, the KKK returned with a vengeance. Their violence prompted otherwise nonviolent civil rights protesters to advocate for the carrying of firearms. For example, one leader of the SNCC, Fannie Lou Hamer, said publicly, quote, "I keep a shotgun in every corner of my bedroom, and the first cracker even look like he wants to throw some dynamite on my porch won't write his mama again," end quote. Many leaders of the civil rights movement, in fact, became disillusioned with Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach. Malcolm X, for example, had long disagreed, and about the black man arming himself in self-defense, he said in 1964, quote, A man with a rifle or a club can only be stopped by a person who defends himself with a rifle or a club. That's equality. If the United States government doesn't want you and me to have rifles, then take the rifles away from those racists, end quote. Malcolm X was often portrayed as a violent extremist promoting lawless behavior, but he was only advocating resistance to extremist violence within the law.
If it's legal for a man to carry or have in his possession a rifle or a shotgun, especially faced with what Negroes in this country are confronted with, they should have it. They shouldn't go out attacking someone with it, but in the face of the brutality that our people encounter, it's not unjust to teach a Negro to have a shotgun or a rifle in his house.
What if it were illegal to have a shotgun or a rifle in a prison zone? Yeah, what if it were illegal? That's correct. Would you still advocate it?
I would never advocate anything illegal.
Even in an area where Negroes could be attacked?
I would never advocate anything illegal.
Stokely Carmichael, one of the original SNCC Freedom Riders, also would eventually move away from advocating nonviolence and instead preach the message of Black Power, stating, quote, "We got to, now, got to get some guns. We don't need the guns to attack the white man. We need the guns because we believe in equality," end quote. Black armed defense groups began appearing, like the Deacons for Defense in Louisiana and the Black Armed Guard in North Carolina. Robert F. Williams, the North Carolina integration activist and local leader of the NAACP, who had founded the Black Armed Guard, wrote an influential book called Negroes with Guns, in which he advocated for, quote, armed self-reliance, end quote, stating that Black Americans, quote, cannot receive justice from the courts. They must convict their attackers on the spot. They must meet violence with violence, end quote. Williams had a profound effect on Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, a community torn apart by police violence against Black residents. In 1966, they formed the Black Panther Party for self-defense, advocating for such causes as freedom, education, employment, equality before the law, and an end to the unjustified murder of Black people by police, such as Denzel Dowell, an unarmed man who was shot 6 to 10 times as he fled the scene of a liquor store burglary by police who then allowed him to bleed out without ever calling an ambulance. The Black Panthers armed themselves with rifles and took it upon themselves to monitor police activities, which they called, quote-unquote, cop watching. Police began wrongfully arresting Black Panthers simply for standing near them while legally possessing firearms in an open carry state. But the law was on the Black Panthers' side. Unsurprisingly then, an effort was made to change the law, to institute gun control specifically, as we have seen so many times in our history, to disarm the Black populace. The National Rifle Association, or NRA, was founded in 1871, the same year that the Ku Klux Klan Act was passed to suppress that domestic terror group. But for most of its early history, its purpose was to promote firearm training and sport licensing. It was never really a gun rights advocacy organization, and certainly not a lobbying group. Even when the National Firearms Act of 1934 was passed to curb the mafia violence perpetrated with the Tommy gun, they expressed only limited concerns. Only after the assassination of JFK, when there was more call for gun control to prevent disturbed murderers from accessing guns, did the NRA take a more active political role. And this was largely at the insistence of one Harlan Carter. Carter was the racist who had single-handedly managed to militarize the Border Patrol and organize the mass deportation campaign he racistly called, quote, Operation Wetback, end quote, in the 50s. In fact, it is Carter's tenure at the Border Patrol that set much of the stage for Trump's mass deportation campaigns today. During his years of leadership in the NRA, he helped to transform the organization into the crusader for uncompromising individual gun rights that we know today. And yet, when the forces arrayed against the Black Panthers in California, including Governor Ronald Reagan, worked to pass the Mulford Act to disarm them, the NRA under Harlan Carter was suddenly all for gun control and supported the efforts. The Mulford Act did not attempt to infringe on gun rights generally or even to end open carry in the state. Rather, it sought to implement a permitting requirement such that police chiefs and county sheriffs could decide who was allowed to carry firearms. It was a return to the Black Codes, and Black Panthers saw it for exactly what it was. Therefore, they protested the law at the state legislature, again while lawfully carrying rifles. Before entering and occupying the Capitol building in protest, Bobby Seale declared, quote, "The American people in general and the Black people in particular must take careful note of the racist California legislature aimed at keeping the Black people disarmed and powerless," end quote. The Panthers were arrested and the law was passed. But the hypocrisy of the NRA and conservative politicians who tout a gun control for thee but not for me attitude was also forever made clear. In all the years since, this entrenchment of gun rights for whites and criminalization of gun carrying for Black people has continued apace. The individual right interpretation of the Second Amendment that Harlan Carter and the NRA have supported since the 60s became the law of the land in District of Columbia versus Heller in 2006, and even permitting laws were deemed unconstitutional in the 2022 New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin decision. And yet, even though the Supreme Court has consistently ruled in support of this individual right to keep and carry firearms, even outside the home, in practice, it is only extended to the white population, as Black citizens are consistently defined as criminals and therefore viewed as armed and dangerous when they carry firearms. For a crystal clear illustration of what I mean, consider the NRA's reaction to Ruby Ridge, when it characterized the white people being shot for having guns as quote-unquote patriots fighting against a war on firearms ownership, and Waco, when it characterized authorities as quote jackbooted government thugs, end quote, for their actions against white firearm owners. Then compare that to the cases of John Crawford and Philando Castile. In 2014, Crawford had gone to Walmart to buy an air rifle, and as he carried this toy around the store, the police were called about a Black man carrying a gun. They arrived quickly and promptly shot Crawford dead. The NRA said nothing. In 2016, Philando Castile was shot dead by police in front of his girlfriend and their 4-year-old daughter for having a firearm, even though he informed the officer that he had it on him, that he was licensed to carry it, and that he had no intentions of pulling it out. The NRA said only that it was quote-unquote troubling, and offered nothing further beyond a boilerplate statement that it supports everyone's right to bear arms. The history of the country is clear here. No matter what your views are on gun ownership and the rights associated with it, like so many other rights and privileges, they have not historically, nor in modern times, been extended to Black Americans equally. So today, when the Trump administration tramples the gun rights of white people and MAGA reveals their total double standard when it comes to whose rights they defend and when, we must keep this Black history in mind and remember that there have always been two Americas, as Langston Hughes showed in his poem, "Let America Be America Again," which corresponds so perfectly to MAGA's motto. In that powerful poem, one speaker calls for America to, quote, be the dream it used to be, end quote, while a black speaker, voice muted in the background by parentheses, declares, quote, it never was America to me, end quote. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. As an update on patron fulfillment, I'm still locked out of my publishing platform and unable to order new author copies of my historical novel. I apologize to patrons who are looking forward to that perk. I'll update as I can. Thank you for your continued support. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, let us again debunk a common misquotation. It's often claimed that George Washington said, quote, a free people ought not only to be armed and disciplined, but they should have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which would include their own government, end quote. A perfect quotation for the insurrection theory of gun rights. Except, in reality, this quote has been distorted through years and years of quotation and misquotation. Originally, Washington said in a 1790 address to Congress, quote, a free people ought not only to be armed, but disciplined, to which end a uniform and well-digested plan is requisite, and their safety and interest require that they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent on others for essential, particularly for military supplies, end quote. It was not an appeal for an individual right to bear arms as a check against an oppressive government, but rather for the manufacture of weapons to be used by a well-regulated militia, which today has been made obsolete by our extremely well-equipped standing army.
What did it take to survive an ancient siege?
Why was the cult of Dionysus behind so many slave revolts in ancient Rome?
What's the tragic history and mythology behind Japan's most haunted ancient forest?
We're Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl. Join us to explore ancient history and mythology from a fun, sometimes tipsy perspective.
Find us at ancienthistoryfangirl.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, my name is Matt, host of the Pirate History Podcast. Pirates rank among the most mythologized and romanticized of all historical figures. It can become easy to forget that pirates were real people that had real-world concerns. If you like tales of high-seas adventure, daring do, and also want to learn more about who Blackbeard supported to be king, you can learn more about all of that at the Pirate History Podcast.